Welcome. This is the last formal lecture in the International Marketing course. We'll do a summary lecture, but this is the kind of last of the main body of lectures. And in this lecture, what I want to do is talk about marketing metrics. Effectively, how is it that you would be evaluating the effectiveness of your marketing activities? Now, there's some basics to marketing metrics. Probably the most basic thing about marketing metrics is the lack of really good ones in a singular sense. And this is reflected in the famous quote by John Wanamaker: "Half of my advertising is wasted. I just don't know which half." So, in that sense, there's always been this difficulty within the marketing realm to have a kind of view as to what is and what is not effective. And again, a lot of this will depend very specifically on the nature of the activities and the mixture of the products and a whole host of other things which would provide you with data. But the major problem that exists in the marketing realm is a lack of line of sight between a singular marketing action and the material impact on customer behavior. And this has been known for quite some time. And as data has gotten better, some issues have been resolved. But take advertising as the first example. Advertising has a distributed lag effect, which means that advertising today, for example, will affect demand tomorrow, demand the day after, demand the week after. But there will be some decay associated with that. But the question then becomes, all right, well, if I've got an advertising campaign which is going over several weeks, or even several months, and it's got this distributed lag effect where individuals who might see it kind of get a bit more of an impact, but then that decays, and then they see it again, that gets added to what's left, and that decays, and on and on and on. So there are models that talk about how you might be able to estimate this, but these are all very imperfect. So advertising in that sense is even worse than research and development expenditures. Promotion is probably one of the more complicated ones in the sense that it has an impact uh, pretty quickly, but the question is that impact material or not? So, for example, some of the earliest promotion models were based upon simply shifting demand around, so that I would promote products as a way of kind of reducing the inventory in the store and pushing that inventory onto the customers who would, let's say, over purchase it, but keep a stock of it in their own home. So it was more or less a way of shifting inventory costs. Today, if you look at a lot of the data, most promotions don't seem to have tremendously big long-term effects. In fact, they may have no long-term effects. Essentially, what ends up happening is the consumers learn to shift around. It may also be the case, for example, that pricing has signaling effects. So, in addition to having, let's say, a signaling effect and income effects, um, what really is kind of the component of these types of things, where there's a kind of an endogeneity relative to the pricing structures. And then all activities have spillovers. There are things like variety seeking. Customers aren't necessarily going to behave according to very singular types of rules. You might be able to get a kind of fair model of an average customer in a segment, but once you start to try to narrow this down to more fine-grained information about, let's say, smaller segments or individual consumers, you get overwhelmed by the complexity of the consumer behavior. So there are these huge issues with respect to the marketing metrics, and these are made even worse, of course, when you move into the international realm, where different types of customers are going to be reacting to different things with different sets of competitors. There may be different age groups. There may be different ways of advertising, as we saw, for example, through the use of influencers or the use of media, social media versus regular media. These things will all add complexity into the metric components. Now, there's a very naive model behind a lot of this, and unfortunately, like most naive models, it has kind of huge problems. And that is that the naive model is similar in some ways to naive models of research and development, and that is that you make an investment, and that investment flows through in some way, shape, or form. That investment has a cost, which ultimately affects the return, but the marketing returns show up in a number of different ways. Higher customer value and satisfaction, increased customer attraction, increased customer retention, and a kind of equity value, lifetime equity value, which might be related to loyalty. Um, but again, this is it's a nice model in the sense that it's simple because you can sort of say, okay, well, where's my value? Well, I can try to look at customer value and satisfaction. I might look at attraction. In other words, how many new customers do I get? I might look at retention, such as repeat purchasing. Um, I might look at loyalty, which kind of might be measured on some long-term repeat purchase activities. And but I've got to dollarize this. I've got to figure out what this is relative to the cost. But if I'm making marketing investments every day, how do I know what the impact is of this every day? If this was just simply I invest in one marketing activity at the beginning of the year and wait for the return to show up, that is fairly easy to do in the sense of measurement. But you have all sorts of problems associated with what it is that you're doing. So one is, for example, the time frame of the return. What's the half-life of the effect? How long are people retained? How long are they loyal? How long does the attraction effect work, given that you're going to pick off the people most susceptible to being attracted at the beginning of the campaign? In addition, what's the discount rate for that marketing investment? It is the weighted average cost of capital for the firm in total. There are lots of reasons to argue that it might not be. What about the distribution of the activities? It isn't just like this kind of throw money at marketing and not break that into advertising, influencers, social media advertising, point of sale customer interactions. How do I disassemble all of this? And you have additional problems, in the sense that many investment decisions are anchored in prior decisions. So both in case of research and development and advertising as kind of classic examples of this, these are usually budgeted based upon kind of a percent of sales. So an organization will typically try to budget its future marketing expenditures around some historic sales revenue figure. And Richard Smallensee, back in the 1970s, wrote a book called The Economics of Advertising, in which he showed that a lot of the impact of advertising is actually misattributed to actual advertising. In other words, the model says advertising leads to sales, but what he showed is in fact, the relationship may be sales leads to advertising, in the sense that it's related to the budgeting that the firm does. From an international perspective, do these models hold in the same way in each country? Do I do this on a global basis? Do I do it on a regional basis? Do I do it on a local market basis? How is it I break this down in a way that allows me to kind of do the measurement? Companies like Coca-Cola have a tendency to use global measures. So they apply the same measures across all their different markets, at least for the Coke product. But is it realistic to do that for all companies? And of course, the answer to that question is no. So the naive model has the simplicity, but that simplicity hides a lot of things. Now, there are lots and lots and lots of metrics out there, and this is where part of the difficulty comes in, and that is you can kind of pick and choose the metrics that you want. So different companies use them in different ways. This is just one example. For example, the customer churn rate. Customers lost during a month as a percent of the customers at the start of the month and customers added in that month. So grocery chains, for example, look at churn rate. Even companies like Netflix, for example, look at churn rates. Churn rates are also used, for example, in social media types of accounts, looking at whether individuals are on the site or off the site. Retention rates, and that is customers at the end of the month versus new customers at the beginning. Simply, are you retaining in some individuals? In other words, if they were there last month or the year next month. If you compare the churn rate, again, go back to this example here. I was doing some work with one very large NGO, an environmental NGO, and one of the things that was very interesting was that their supporters change about 50% a year. In other words, they lose 50% of their supporters. So people who give money to them, donate to them, buy a subscription to whatever it is they're offering. In 1 year, the next year, 50% of those people are gone. So if you looked at that, the churn rate and the retention rate will have a relationship to them. So if 50% of them leave, obviously 50% of them might be coming back. But if 50% are leaving every year, pretty soon you have a very small number of very loyal people. And then you have measures such as customer lifetime value. This has been a big one that companies, particularly when they have longer term customers, use, and that they look at the profit margin against the retention rate or the repeat rate, and then they look at that against some sort of discount. So they have a cost of capital rate, kind of an annual interest rate, and they more or less rate this as against their retention rate. Airlines use this as an example, which is one reason why they'll have certain customers they'll pay a lot of attention to, simply because they see those customers as having longer lifetime value to them. So there are many different ways to think about this. And then you have other ones such as cost per lead. How much does it cost you for generating prospects? Cost per acquisition, cost per click and impression, return on advertising expenditure. Again, this one's probably of the other ones, those are fairly easy to measure. But this one might be, the return on advertising spend is actually quite a difficult one to estimate. Conversion rate, and that is, if you have an acquisition, how do you convert them into, let's say, a subscription-based plan or upgrading to a higher value offering. Average order value, churn, retention rates, which I talked about, and customer lifetime value. And the thing that's kind of interesting about this is that most companies are actually quite haphazard in what they use. So if you actually look at companies, some, again, I use Coca-Cola as an example, have had a fairly sophisticated set of metrics that they've used over a long period of time. But again, if you think about the product that they're selling, there isn't a huge degree of complexity. It's a fast-moving consumer good. Fast-moving consumer goods in some ways are actually a little bit easier to measure the metrics, to measure metrics. But if you're an automobile dealer, you're a manufacturer of automobiles, you're a Mercedes or you're a BMW or Ford or Volvo, how do you actually measure customer lifetime value? Well, it's difficult because you don't necessarily know whether you're going to get kind of a loyalty and retention. There might be some individuals who use those products continuously. For companies like Apple, it might be a lot easier because they have a high loyalty base. So they have a lot of high cross-selling, and therefore it might be easier for them to kind of come up with a measure of something like customer lifetime value. And you can see these in some of the statistics here. And that is that about 38% of the companies use a kind of an ROI, revenue versus cost type of measure. Again, a lot of this will depend on the company, the style of product they do. 39% use financial metrics. but not profitability. And then 23% used kind of more traditional metrics, but not financial ones. So in some sense, you're looking at this and sort of saying, well, it's a bit of horses for courses. The companies are using metrics that they think that they can kind of get a bit of a grip on, but not necessarily all using in any real way, shape, or form the same ones. So I'll give an example of this using an MBA, a school I was involved with a number of years ago. And we actually did have a customer lifetime value estimation for our students. We only had MBAs and executive MBAs, and we effectively tracked the alumni over a long period of time. And what this allowed us to do is it allowed us to look at not only an individual who might get an MBA or an executive MBA from us, but whether they would come back for different types of programs. We would then have our corporate customers who would be, on a regular basis, would be sending individuals to executive programs, and on down the line. So more or less what we did is we had different segments of individuals we were looking at, basically around the products we were offering, which were the MBA, executive MBA, and various executive programs, some of which were open programs, some of which were specialist programs, some of which were in company programs. And we could estimate lifetime values of this. When I was on the board of one university, we were actually able to estimate the lifetime value of undergraduate students, because we had a long history of donation information from alumni. So we could, for example, track individuals and come through with estimates of the lifetime value of those individuals to the university. In fact, at one point in time, we had a discussion of removing all tuition from the university because the lifetime value was so large relative to the tuition. We thought that it might be possible for us to remove all tuition from the metric and still run the university very effectively. So you have kind of different ways of doing this, and different companies kind of view their success in this to a greater or a lesser degree. And when they look at their marketing programs, they don't necessarily come out with any clear idea that yes, indeed, marketing matters to them. Large portion, in fact, these here, they have some impact, but they don't necessarily know what it is. Some other ones clearly believe that the marketing materially matters to what it is that they're doing. Now, when you go to the B2B side rather than the B2C side, so the stuff that we've been talking about up to this point was mainly B2B or B2C, sorry. You have a whole series of ways of thinking about this, and a lot of these, as I'll come back to in a minute, are related to touch points. But I'm not going to go through each of these, but you can see very easily in all of this the returns that different media types of campaigns drive, across the company. And the point of this is that you look at a lot of these and sort of say, well, if I can earn a lot more by using Facebook as opposed to, let's say, using tweets, why might I not exclusively use tweets? And the answer, of course, is that these are average measures. But the main point here, again, it shows this kind of horses for courses kind of model here, and that is that you can kind of pick the metrics that you want, and different companies will pick and choose the types of metrics that they want depending upon the goals that they're trying to achieve from specific marketing activities. But ultimately, the issue is not the metric, but the alignment of the metric to the operational priorities. And I think this is kind of a useful way to think about this. And if you do it this way, at least what you're doing is you're sort of kind of having strategically based metrics. In other words, you're saying, here's the strategy, here are the operational priorities that we have based upon that strategy, and here's how we measure whether in fact they matter or not. This is an example here, if you just look at this graphic, where the question, of course, is, are the metrics forward looking, or are the backward looking? Okay, and are they internal metrics or are they external metrics? So in this case here, company metrics apply to an operating period, things like product defects, inventory turnover. These are all internal, but they're forward-looking metrics in the sense that they're looking out at the at effects which will have longer term impacts, reduce product defects, reduce late deliveries. That'll have positive measures. These are sort of kind of, they'll have positive measures on things over here, which will be backward looking, which are effectively the financial metrics. You know them after the fact, typically. In the case of external metrics, well, you're looking at things like awareness, satisfaction, performance. These will have forward effects. Let's say 3 months hence, a month hence, 2 months hence, which lead, for example, to further sales. And again, the marketing metrics like my market share and all of those are, just like sales revenue, they're backward looking measures. So ultimately, you're gonna ask the question, what am I trying to achieve with this investment? So that simple model I gave you where before about awareness, trial, repeat. If this is my what I'm trying to achieve, then I can ask the question, okay, well, when I'm making these investments, how is this going to flow through? How do I drive awareness? How do I drive trial? How do I drive repeat over time? Profits, customer retention, customer lifetime value, brand equity, which is a longer term value measure. What am I ultimately trying to achieve by this? If I'm trying to build up brand equity, what I'm trying to do is I'm trying to build up the intangible value of the brand. That may not immediately show up in things like market share profits, but it will show up over time. For example, if brand equity is the accumulation of profits related to the marketing investment, then of course this would be increasing over time. And then I can ask, okay, what part of this is internal, what part of this is external? And this will have different pressure points in terms of, reducing product defects is something which it might be a production thing, which of course has a link on effect to performance via customer satisfaction. Am I looking at what we're doing or what we have done? So again, these forward-looking mechanisms are looking at what we're doing. These mechanisms here, these measures here, are really looking at what are the impacts of what has been done. And then you have a kind of component of this which is predictive. In other words, you're looking at these types of things and saying, if I can increase customer awareness 10% in this, okay, then what's the impact on market share? What's the impact on profits? As opposed to evaluative, and that is, okay, I've done something, and what I want to know is, I want to know to what extent has there been an effect of that thing that I've done. And there are varieties and sequences of metrics. Again, I'm not going to go through all of these because there's quite a lot of stuff here. But you can see these, particularly in the case of digital media, and that's what all of these really are. And you can look at consumption metrics. All right, so these are examples of consumption metrics, retention metrics, sharing metrics, which are related, for example, to that product advocacy type of model, which we talked about with omnichannel marketing, and engagement metrics. Okay, so in this case here, you're looking at kind of the impact by consumption. It really means the impact on the site itself. So I open an email, that's consumption. Okay, the retention metrics, return rate, how many visitors are return visitors, bounce rate. Bounce rate's calculated as 2 clicks, the entry, and then the next click, page per visit, how deep they might go, follower count, etc. Whether they subscribe to things or opt out, and then whether they push things forward for you, and then things like the depth and of that engagement. Okay, so you can see this as an example where you can be looking at kind of the flow through on these and see where the sticking point might be if performance isn't there. Another example of this is more kind of on a B2B side. Lead metrics, new leads generated, touch points, the pipeline that might flow through from that. Okay. And all of that might, for example, kind of flow through various other costs, such as volume of content, production costs, the per piece placed in the site, and so on down the line. So you can look at these types of metrics as well. Now, this relates probably most effectively to these customer journey models we talked about before. This is what's known as a customer funnel. And it looks like that awareness, trial, repeat model, but it's kind of expanded out. So it also looks like those moments of truth models. So you have awareness, engagement, consideration, purchase, adoption, retention, expansion, advocacy. And each of these, okay, has a component to it. Okay. And they're linked back to aspects of things that are paid for. Okay, so you pay to kind of get awareness and engagement. Things which are owned. Okay, so these are things which hold within the company. Things which are shared. Okay, and then things which are earned. Okay, but the main point of this, of course, is that just like those digital touch points that we talked about, in the digital marketing lecture, you have different components at different touch points. Okay, so you can look at exposure, engagement, influence, impact, advocacy. This isn't quite perfectly linked to this model, but the main point is this is kind of the first stage, second stage, third stage, fourth stage, first stage, second stage, third stage, fourth stage, fifth stage. So each of these has kind of aspects to it. And then the question, of course, is how do I get to these? And I can pay for them. Right? I can ultimately own them. In other words, these would be things which are held within the company. They could be things that I share with others or I share with the customer. So, for example, store visits, attending events, these are shared activities. And they could be things that are sort of kind of earned, which is more of the secondary type of thing. So I earn a recommendation in this regard. So you can link the metrics, and in fact, this is a very smart thing to do, to sort of say, okay, at each touch point, what's the metric that touch point has? Because ultimately, if the goal is to generate this advocacy, to not just kind of retain a customer, then what is it that I'm going to measure as a measure of advocacy? If all I'm really concerned about is retaining customers, then I can stop at this point. I don't need to worry about this. If all I'm concerned about is purchase, then I'm not really worrying about any additional retention or any advocacy. Then I can stop here. It may be that purchase doesn't lead to retention or doesn't lead to expansion, but it leads to advocacy. So, for example, if I purchase an automobile, it doesn't. What's it mean to retain the customer in this sense? At least from the standpoint of say BMW or Mercedes, as opposed to the dealership. The dealer might want to retain the customer for service reasons, but the question then becomes, okay, well, from purchase, what I want to do is I want to get people to advocate, and to get them to advocate, I want them to actually do that in a way that allows other customers to be retained. All of this would be things that I would want to try to build into my model. And finally, when you start applying this to the international marketing context, you'll see that there's an enormously high variety of these types of things. So companies will vary considerably in how they apply these metrics. So I gave the example Coca-Cola, which uses more standardized metrics because their brand strategy is global, right? And this is typical of a branded house, sub-brand or global branding model. They have strong market share imperatives, mainly because if they control market share, that's effectively a key measure for them. The price they're limited in some ways around pricing. Others, such as the Accor Hotels Group, might apply identical metrics, but with differential benchmarks. So the benchmarks between markets might change. So everybody provides the same metrics, but they're not evaluated in the same way. You have those who operate, let's say, a house of brands model. Effectively, that's got to be done, each brand, each country in a semi-autonomous way. And the main point that all of this kind of leads to is that for multinationals in particular, a dollar investment in one country must align with a dollar investment in another country, independent of the country or the type of investment. But when you look at, for example, the transfer pricing models that we discussed in the pricing lecture, you may not necessarily want to use a profit metric in an environment in which you've got kind of complicated transfer pricing rules, which are meant to kind of meet some financial goals associated with retention of profits or reduction of taxes. In that environment, you wouldn't want to use a financial model because that's a skewed measure. What you might want to do is to use more market share, customer retention models, and so on that line. So this also leads to kind of a differential associated with what the role of the subsidiary is. And this is a very simple N2I2 matrix, which Bartlett and Goshal put together, which I think has some degree of validity. And one aspect of this is to say, okay, well, how important is the local market? And by important, you're really talking about things like scale and profitability. And what this means is that markets which are high in importance are essentially going to be your bigger markets, the ones which generate much more cash flow. And then there's an issue of local competence, and that is, are you internally generating things which potentially could benefit the rest of the multinational network? So the importance of the local market may be effectively a kind of money out sort of measure, and the local competence may be a skill competency in. And according to this model or this framework, the last thing you want to be is low on both. In other words, you're not providing any real spillover benefits to other parts of the organization, and the market's pretty small. Basically, black holes are places you clearly would want to divest. You have other situations where you have very large markets, but the market itself isn't actually providing a lot of spillover benefits. In other words, the implementer markets are essentially there to sell products. So you might have very large markets in which you sell products, but you don't necessarily do any development work. So you might, for example, be a company like GE Medical. You might be selling large numbers of refurbished or kind of middle market CT scanners in places like India. You might make money there, but you're not necessarily developing the technology there. You have markets for which the market itself might be small, but they actually generate things for you. Many small countries, small by population, Australia being a very good example of this. But you might also make an argument that there might be countries like the Netherlands or Belgium, Denmark, Norway, where the market itself isn't huge. The market doesn't necessarily generate a lot for you in terms of material returns relative to your total profitability, but they might actually provide a lot of skills. They might be bases from which you can test new products. They might be areas in which you can sort of kind of develop technologies So, for example, if you look at pharmaceutical companies have research facilities in Switzerland, but Switzerland isn't necessarily going to be a very large market for them in terms of medical sales. It is a contributor market, and then you kind of have the big ones where you can have strategic leadership. These are markets which provide you with both big returns and potentially with high sources of internal competence. And obviously, if you want to treat the EU as a singular entity, it might be the EU, it might be United States, might be China, could be any number of markets, where the market in some sense is almost capable of standing on its own. And in each of these, you'll have different types of metrics. You're not going to measure the return on marketing in an implementer market the same way you would in a contributor market, or the same way you would in a strategic leadership market, nor are you going to necessarily use the same metrics in environments in which the tax rates are highly differential, or there are other types of additional charges which might affect the returns in an artificial way. Ideally, what you want to do is you want to be able to compare apples to apples. You want to be able to use similar types of effective benchmarks. And what that might mean is that you don't use profitability measures, because profitability measures are distorted based upon certain types of cost, such as taxes. And therefore, in that situation, what you might want to do is you might want to focus more on more direct marketing measures, such as market share, customer retention, customer loyalty, and so on and on. And also the other aspect of this is that entry mode will influence these metrics. Wholly owned foreign subsidiaries will simply be operable as if they were any other part of the company. In other words, there's a lot of internalization associated with it. If you leave out the transfer pricing kind of bits. Franchisees are controllable in the sense that they can be required to use point of sale systems and operational metrics that are standardized globally. This is what you see with almost all franchising systems. So if you're running, if you go into Holiday Inn Hotel or Holiday Inn Express Hotel, you go into an Ibis hotel, you go into a McDonald's. It doesn't matter which country you're in. It turns out the hotel reservation system is the same. The way in which things are charged is effectively the same. They use the same computer systems to do what it is that they're doing. The same with airlines, and in fact, many stores. H&M, Zara. It doesn't matter which country you're in. The point of sales system is the same, and hence the operational metrics that they can get access to are the same. So essentially, you have that aspect of it, and then you have agreements which allow you to control a lot of the local marketing. So you're having a good ability to kind of measure what's going on. The metrics can be very detailed, and they could reflect both financials and direct marketing type of activities, such as loyalty and retention and customer awareness and satisfaction and so on and on. And in the case of franchises in particular, because there's always a profit sharing and royalty component, the companies have to have control over these point of sale systems. Otherwise, it would be quite difficult for them to ensure that they're getting the right information to be able to charge royalties and get their share of the profits. Joint ventures that operate separately as separate companies, and they will have their own operational metrics. So it's conceivable that they will be very, very, very different in this regard. The question, of course, is whether that JV also has some type of licensing set of agreements. If they have licensing agreements, then there might be things which are more centralized, like you see with franchise models. And because exporters and agents create distance between between production and consumers, it may be difficult in this situation to get the appropriate metrics. So in a lot of cases, what you find that the originating company, the producing company, which is using an exporter and an agent, doesn't even bother with the exporter or the agent as a source of these measures. It goes completely around them. So it'll hire a market research company, and that market research company will do sales store audits. So this is quite common in a lot of clothing manufacturers where they're exported from the factory, let's say in China or Vietnam or Bangladesh or wherever, and they go to a variety of different stores. The companies like Nike, Adidas, etc., they might know specifically what things are being produced and exported, but they don't necessarily know anything. If they go to uh, JD.com, or they're being sold through Amazon, or they're being sold through retail operations, they don't necessarily know what's going on in those retail operations from those retail operations, because they're so disparate and so scattered. So what they'll do is they'll hire market research agencies, they'll do store audits, they'll do all of those sorts of things. And essentially, this is probably the weakest end of the stick. This puts a lot more pressure on the company to go out and seek out the customers more directly. So in that sense, they have a harder job to do. They're not necessarily going to be able to use profit types of measures in this situation here, because those types of profit measures are much harder to get at, because they're not controlling the pricing. They're not controlling as much in this situation. So with that, that's the end of the lecture. Effectively, what it means is that there's kind of a lot of horses for courses in the metrics models. And when you're looking at marketing metrics, the key is to have those marketing metrics aligned with the underlying strategy, to be able to parse them along things like the touch points of the customer journey. And then finally, to also link them back to how the multinational is structured and what the multinational is attempting to achieve by having that structure in terms of its entry mode of operations.